Hulk Hogan's final words before he died will make you cry. The immortal Hulk Hogan is known for his wild energy, strong charisma, and unforgettable legacy, but what he said in his final moments will truly break your heart. In this emotional tribute, we reveal the powerful and touching final words that Hulk Hogan left behind, showing a side of the WWE legend few have ever seen. Under the dim glow of a quiet Florida sunset, the air around Hulk Hogan's Clearwater mansion felt different. The house, once a place filled with laughter, music, and the constant hum of visitors, had fallen silent. For decades, Hogan had been larger than life. His booming voice, his outrageous charisma, his ability to captivate arenas of screaming fans, making him an icon unlike any other. But in those final hours, the man behind the red and yellow colors wasn't the indestructible, immortal hero fans saw in the ring. He was Terry Bollea, a father, a friend, and a man facing the weight of his own mortality. Those close to him say that his final words, spoken softly, with a voice that carried more love than strength, were the most human thing he had ever shared. In the days leading up to that night, Hogan's health had been in decline. Though he rarely spoke publicly about the details, the truth was that years of physical strain from wrestling, old injuries, and relentless touring had taken their toll. Those who saw him in private could see the signs: slower steps, a weariness in his once unstoppable frame, and moments where pain crept into his smile. Yet he never complained. He had made a career out of being the man who always kept going, the man who told millions of Hulkamaniacs to never give up. But behind closed doors, in the privacy of his home, Hogan had begun to have deep conversations with the people he loved most. Conversations about life, about mistakes, about what really mattered in the end. On that final day, the mansion was quiet except for the gentle hum of the ocean breeze slipping through the open balcony doors. Close family and a handful of lifelong friends had gathered, sensing that their time with him was running short. Hogan was in his bedroom, the same room filled with framed memories of his career. Photos from WrestleMania, championship belts, fan letters, and even the guitar gifted to him by a famous rock star decades ago. But in that moment, none of those accolades seemed to matter to him. What mattered were the people who stood around his bed, holding his hands, whispering words of comfort. It was said that Hogan's breathing had become slower, his voice quieter, but his eyes remained clear and sharp. He looked around at the faces in the room. His children, a few of his closest friends from the wrestling world, and people who had stood by him in his hardest moments. Those who were there described the atmosphere as both heartbreaking and strangely peaceful. The man who had lived most of his life in the chaos of flashing cameras and roaring crowds was now surrounded by stillness. The ticking of the clock on the wall was almost deafening, marking every second like a countdown no one wanted to reach zero. A former wrestler who had traveled the road with Hogan for decades later said that in those last hours, there was a noticeable shift in him. It wasn't the Hogan we saw on TV, he said quietly. It was Terry. It was a man who knew his time was short, but he wanted to make sure the people he loved knew exactly what was in his heart. That friend described Hogan reaching out to clasp his hand, squeezing with surprising strength. "Brother," Hogan whispered, a faint smile touching his lips. "We had one hell of a ride, didn't we?" The man nodded, unable to hold back his tears. "Don't cry for me. Just remember me for the laughs, the road trips, the matches. Remember the good stuff." As the evening deepened, Hogan seemed to grow more reflective. He called his children closer, looking each of them in the eye. Those who witnessed it say his voice trembled slightly, but there was a fierce sincerity in his tone. "I wasn't perfect," he admitted. "I made mistakes. But every single thing I did with love in my heart for my family and my fans. If I hurt you, I'm sorry. If I made you proud, I'm grateful. And if you love me, just know I've always loved you back." One of his children clutched his hand tighter, whispering, "We love you, Dad." Hogan's eyes softened, and for a brief moment, the legendary showman was just a father, holding on to the last pieces of the life he had built. People who had known Hogan for decades say his mind was still as sharp as ever, even in those final hours. He spoke about his early days, wrestling in small venues before anyone knew his name, and how much those days meant to him. It wasn't about the fame back then, he said quietly. It was about the love of the game. About giving the people in the crowd a night they'd never forget. That's what it's always been about for me. A friend leaned in and reminded him that he had given that gift to millions over the years. Hogan's response was simple but profound. Then I did my job. But it was in the final moments, just as the Florida sky turned a deep shade of indigo, that Hogan spoke the words that would be remembered forever by those in the room. He took a deep breath, his hand resting over his heart, and said, tell them I'm at peace. Tell them not to be sad. I've had a life bigger than I ever dreamed. And when you think of me, think of the love, not the loss. His voice faltered, but he forced a small chuckle, adding, and tell the Hulkamaniacs to keep training, say their prayers, and eat their vitamins. Always. The room fell silent after that. Those words hung in the air, heavy with emotion but filled with warmth. There were no more speeches, no more attempts to be the larger-than-life hero. In those final breaths, Hogan had given something far greater than a wrestling promo. He had given his truth. Those who heard it said it was like he was trying to release everyone from the pain of losing him, to give them one last gift of hope before he was gone. A few minutes later, Hogan closed his eyes, his breathing slowing to a soft rhythm. His family and friends stayed close, some holding his hands, others simply resting their palms on his arm or shoulder. Outside, the waves continued their steady rhythm against the shore, as if nature itself was marking the passage of a legend. Inside the room, the people who knew him best silently prayed, cried, and whispered their goodbyes. They knew the man lying there wasn't just Hulk Hogan, the wrestling icon. He was the friend who told the best road stories, the father who tried his best, the man who could light up a room with a laugh, and the human being who was ready to face whatever came next. When the moment came, it was quiet. There was no grand announcement, no cameras, no roaring crowd, just the sound of loved ones telling him they loved him, and the faintest smile on his face, as if he had heard them. One friend later said, he went out the way he wanted, surrounded by people who loved him, with no regrets left to settle. And that smile, that was his way of telling us he was ready. In the hours after his passing, word began to spread. Fans across the world were in disbelief. Social media was flooded with tributes, photos, and personal stories from people who had met him or been inspired by him. Old clips of his most iconic matches and interviews went viral again, each one serving as a reminder of the energy he had brought into the world. But among all the memories and celebrations of his career, those final words, think of the love, not the loss, seemed to resonate the most. They were shared, reposted, and spoken aloud in locker rooms, fan conventions, and homes around the world. In the wrestling community, the reaction was deeply personal. Wrestlers from multiple generations spoke about how Hogan had helped them, mentored them, or simply been a friendly face backstage. Some shared private stories of Hogan visiting sick fans in hospitals, refusing publicity for those moments because he didn't want it to be about him. Others remembered how he could diffuse tension in a room with a joke, even in the middle of intense backstage politics. For many, his final words were a reflection of the man they knew, someone who valued connection over conflict, love over ego. By the next morning, a small group gathered again at Hogan's Clearwater mansion. The sun rose over the ocean, casting golden light across the water. They sat together, drinking coffee, talking quietly, and replaying the events of the night before. One of Hogan's oldest friends summed it up perfectly. He lived like a lion, but he left like a saint. And I'll never forget the look in his eyes when he told us he was at peace. Even as plans for a public memorial began to take shape, those closest to Hogan knew that the most important part of his legacy wasn't just his wrestling career, it was the way he made people feel. His ability to connect with fans, to make them believe in themselves, and to leave them with hope was unmatched. His final words were simply an extension of that legacy, a final promo not for a match, but for life itself. And so, as the world mourned the loss of Hulk Hogan, those who loved him took comfort in knowing that his last message was one of peace, gratitude, and love. He may have been the immortal Hulk Hogan to millions, but in the quiet of that Florida night, he was simply Terry, saying goodbye the only way he knew how, with heart. The morning after Hulk Hogan's passing, Clearwater, Florida, awoke to a strange quiet. The neighborhood surrounding his mansion was lined with cars, not from the usual stream of friends or colleagues dropping by, but from fans who had driven through the night, leaving flowers, bandanas, action figures, and handwritten letters at the edge of his property. Some stood silently with bowed heads. Others shared stories in low, reverent tones, as though speaking too loudly might disturb the peacefulness that lingered over the place where he had spent his final moments. Inside the mansion, Hogan's family and closest friends moved through the halls slowly, still processing the enormity of what had happened. The night before had felt like a dream, long, heavy, and surreal. But now reality was settling in. The bed where he had taken his last breath still bore the faint scent of his cologne. His boots sat by the dresser, perfectly aligned, as if he might return at any moment to lace them up for one last entrance. The robe he had worn during his quieter days hung from the back of a chair, catching the morning light through the balcony doors. It was these small, ordinary details that broke the hearts of those who loved him most. They were reminders that, despite his immortal persona, he was still a man with habits, routines, and a life beyond the spotlight. Plans for a private funeral had already begun before the sun had fully risen. Hogan's wish had always been clear. He didn't want a grand arena memorial, at least not as his farewell. "The fans have already given me my send-off," he had once told a friend after a Hall of Fame ceremony. "When I go, I want to be home. I want to be with the people who knew Terry, not just Hulk." His family honored that request. They decided the funeral would take place on the grounds of his Clearwater estate, in a quiet, secluded garden he loved, overlooking the water. The ceremony would be by invitation only, no cameras, no press, just family, a few lifelong friends, and a handful of wrestlers who had shared the road with him in the earliest days. The days leading up to the funeral became a blur of preparation. The garden was transformed into a peaceful sanctuary. White folding chairs were arranged in a semicircle facing the ocean. A simple wooden arch was draped in red and yellow flowers, a subtle nod to his iconic colors, without turning the moment into a spectacle. At the center, on a table covered in white linen, sat an urn and a framed photo of Hogan smiling, not the flexing, larger-than-life wrestler in his prime, but the older, gentler man who had found joy in quieter moments. Around the photo were personal mementos. A championship belt, a pair of his signature sunglasses, and the first wrestling program he ever headlined, its pages yellowed with age. On the day of the funeral, the Florida sun shone brightly, but a warm breeze softened the heat. Guests began to arrive early, dressed not in formal black, but in casual clothes, just as Hogan had requested. Some wore bandanas in tribute. Others sported vintage Hulkamania t-shirts, knowing he would have grinned at the sight. Among them were names known to millions, legends from the wrestling world who had shared locker rooms, road trips, and hotel bars with Hogan across decades. There were also people the public wouldn't recognize: the neighbor who had brought him homemade pies, the mechanic who had kept his beloved motorcycles in top condition, and the childhood friend who still called him Terry long after the rest of the world knew him as Hulk. The service began with soft guitar music, the kind Hogan often listened to when he wanted to unwind. A longtime friend, who had once toured with him on the road, stepped forward to speak. His voice cracked as he recalled the first time he met Hogan back when they were both broke young men trying to break into the business. "He had nothing but a dream and a smile big enough to convince you he was already famous," the friend said. And somehow he was right. Even back then, he made you believe in something bigger than yourself. Others spoke too, each offering their own perspective on the man behind the legend. A fellow wrestler from the 80s era told a story about being stranded in a strange city with no money. "I called Hulk, not expecting anything. He was there in an hour with a car, cash, and a joke about how I owed him a steak dinner. That was him. He made time for people when it mattered most. Hogan's daughter stood to speak next, her voice trembling but steady. She spoke of her father's unwavering love, his advice to always walk tall, even if you feel small inside, and the quiet moments they shared away from the cameras, fishing trips, lazy afternoons on the couch, and the way he always made her laugh, even when things were hard. The most emotional moment came when one of Hogan's closest friends read his final words aloud to the gathered mourners. Written down in the hours after his passing so they would not be forgotten, they were exactly as he had spoken them. Tell them I'm at peace. Tell them not to be sad. I've had a life bigger than I ever dreamed. And when you think of me, think of the love, not the loss. The words hung in the air, and for a long moment, no one moved. Many wiped away tears, some openly wept. Even the toughest men in the wrestling business, men who had brawled in front of thousands, stood with eyes glistening, unable to hide their grief. As the ceremony drew to a close, the guests were invited to come forward one by one, to place a flower beside his urn or rest a hand on the table in silent farewell. Some whispered private goodbyes. Others simply stood for a moment, taking in the view of the ocean and the sound of the waves, a reminder of the peace Hogan had found in his final days. In the distance, the faint cry of a seagull echoed over the water, as if nature itself was marking the end of an era. When the final guest had paid their respects, Hogan's son stepped forward to say the last words of the service. Dad always told us to live with love and to fight for what you believe in. He lived that every day, in and out of the ring. And though we have to say goodbye today, his voice, his laugh, his lessons, they're all still here. And they always will be. With that, the family and friends stood together, some holding hands, others with arms around each other's shoulders, watching as the sun began to lower in the sky. A small boat waited offshore, ready to carry a portion of his ashes into the open sea. As the boat drifted away, someone quietly began to hum Real American, Hogan's iconic theme song. Within moments, others joined in, not loudly, but softly, like a shared memory carried on the breeze. It was not a performance. It was a farewell, one last chorus for the man who had once told them all to train hard, say their prayers, and eat their vitamins. That night, after the guests had gone and the garden stood empty, the family stayed behind. They lit candles and placed them around the table where Hogan's photo still stood, the glow casting a warm light over his smiling face. For a while, they sat in silence, listening to the waves and the occasional rustle of palm leaves in the wind. Then, as if on cue, stories began to flow, funny ones, embarrassing ones, and moments that captured exactly who he was. They laughed through their tears, remembering that Hogan himself had said he wanted them to think of the love, not the loss. Outside the estate, the world continued to mourn. Fans across the globe organized their own tributes, holding watch parties of his greatest matches, wearing his colors to wrestling events, and raising funds for charities he had supported. Wrestling arenas around the country dimmed their lights for a 10-bell salute, a tradition reserved for the most respected figures in the industry. The sound of those bells rang heavy, each chime a reminder that the immortal Hulk Hogan had stepped out of the ring for the last time. But even as the sadness lingered, so did his words. They appeared on banners at wrestling shows, on tribute videos, on social media posts from fans who had never met him but felt like they had known him all their lives. Think of the love, not the loss. They were words that transcended wrestling, words that spoke to anyone who had lost someone they loved. In Clearwater, the waves kept rolling in, the same waves Hogan had watched countless times from his balcony. And though the house was quieter now, those who had stood beside him in his final moments believed something deeply, that in some way, he was still there. Not as a shadow or a memory, but as a presence in the laughter they shared, the courage they carried, and the love they refused to let fade. Hulk Hogan, the immortal, had left the arena of life, but his spirit, just as he had promised, remained undefeated. In the hours after Hulk Hogan's private funeral in Clearwater, The world outside his quiet Florida estate erupted. What had begun as whispers in the wrestling community became a global headline. The immortal Hulk Hogan laid to rest, his final words revealed. Every major news outlet carried the story. Sports networks ran special programming, replaying his greatest matches in chronological order. Documentaries were pulled from archives and rebroadcast. Social media feeds flooded with tributes. Grainy Polaroids of fans meeting him in the 1980s, autographed posters from wrestling conventions, and heartfelt captions from people who credited him with shaping their childhoods. What struck people most wasn't just the fact that Hogan was gone, it was what he had chosen to leave behind. His last words, "Think of the love, not the loss," became an instant mantra. They appeared on t-shirts, were painted on banners, and were even tattooed by fans who wanted to carry his message permanently. The wrestling world was no stranger to larger-than-life goodbyes, but this felt different. Hogan's farewell didn't come from the roar of an arena. It came from the stillness of a man who had seen everything, done everything, and, in the end, found peace in something as simple as love. Backstage at WWE headquarters in Stamford, Connecticut, the atmosphere was unlike anything in recent memory. A meeting was called early that morning. Producers, creative teams, executives, and talent relations all gathered in a conference room, many wearing subdued expressions. Vince McMahon, who had been both a business partner and occasional rival to Hogan over the years, was reportedly emotional as he addressed the group. "We're not just talking about a superstar," he said, his voice heavy. "We're talking about the man who changed this business forever." Hulk Hogan didn't just put wrestling on the map, he was the map for an entire generation. In the locker rooms across wrestling promotions, from WWE to AEW to smaller independent circuits, the mood was equally somber. Legends who had shared the road with Hogan picked up the phone to call one another, reliving stories they had told countless times before. They talked about the cramped car rides between towns, the long nights in cheap motels, and the rush of walking out to deafening crowds. More than one veteran admitted that without Hogan, their careers might never have happened. "He opened doors for all of us," one Hall of Famer said in a televised tribute. Whether you liked him, loved him, or sometimes couldn't stand him, you couldn't deny the man's impact. AEW, WWE, and even New Japan Pro Wrestling, companies that didn't always see eye to eye, agreed to honor him with a unified gesture. The following week, at every major wrestling event, the lights would dim, the crowd would rise, and the bell would toll 10 times. The sound was haunting, a deep, resonant reminder of the tradition Hogan had helped shape. Fans stood in silence during those salutes, some holding homemade signs with messages like, "Hogan forever," or "We'll keep training, brother." When the bell rang for the 10th time, chants of "Thank you, Hogan" broke out spontaneously, echoing in arenas from New York to Tokyo. Behind the scenes, Hogan's closest friends in the business began to coordinate something even bigger. A tribute show that would celebrate not only his career, but the man himself. It would not be a somber funeral broadcast, it would be a night of joy, music, storytelling, and wrestling, just as Hogan would have wanted. Wrestlers who hadn't stepped into a ring for years agreed to come out of retirement for one night only, just to honor the man who had given them their first big break. Footage from his matches would play between segments, intercut with home videos, candid photos, and clips of him laughing with fans. But as the industry rallied, the media frenzy intensified. Networks scrambled for exclusive interviews with anyone who had been present during Hogan's final hours. A former WWE commentator, who had known him since the early days, gave a live interview recalling the exact moment he heard about Hogan's passing. "I froze," he admitted, his voice cracking. "Because you grow up thinking guys like Hogan don't die. They're too big, too strong, too immortal. But then you hear his last words, and you realize that's where the real immortality is. In what you leave behind." In Clearwater, the scene outside Hogan's mansion remained a pilgrimage site for fans. Local police set up barriers to manage the crowds, and the city worked with the family to create a temporary memorial space along the waterfront. There, fans could leave flowers, write messages, and share memories without disturbing the family's privacy. The tribute area quickly became covered in yellow and red bandanas, feather boas, replica championship belts, even old-school WWF action figures still in their packaging. Parents brought their children to explain who Hogan was, telling them stories about the time they saw him live or how they used to imitate his famous ear-cup pose in front of the TV. Meanwhile, Hogan's family stayed largely out of the public eye, granting only one statement to the press: Hulk Hogan was a legend to the world, but to us, he was Terry, our father, our brother, our friend. His final wish was for people to remember the love he shared, and we hope that message carries on in all who knew him. The simplicity of the statement resonated with fans. It reminded them that, for all the bright lights and roaring crowds, Hogan had been a human being who wanted the same thing everyone wants: to be loved, and to leave that love behind. As the week went on, tributes poured in from beyond the wrestling community. Musicians, actors, and athletes from other sports shared their own encounters with Hogan. A legendary rock guitarist posted a photo of the two of them from the 90s, writing, "We jammed all night, and he never stopped calling me brother." One of the most genuine guys I ever met. A former NFL player recalled how Hogan had once visited his charity event unannounced, staying for hours to meet fans and help raise money. He didn't come for publicity, the player said. He came because he cared. Television talk shows devoted segments to him, replaying his most famous appearances, from guest spots on sitcoms to his larger-than-life commercials in the 80s and 90s. Late-night hosts reminisced about the sheer charisma he brought to every interview, often breaking into his signature deep, "Well, let me tell you something, brother," just to get the crowd laughing. Even schools and youth programs paid tribute. In several cities, kids in after-school programs painted murals of Hogan in his red and yellow gear, alongside his last words. One program director explained, "It's not just about wrestling, it's about teaching kids the values he preached. Work hard, be kind, and believe in yourself." And yet, despite the public outpouring, some of the most powerful tributes were the quietest ones. In gyms across America, men and women who had grown up idolizing him finished their workouts by looking in the mirror and flexing one last time for the Hulkster. In hospitals, patients undergoing rehab or treatment drew inspiration from his resilience, telling therapists they were training like Hulk would. And in living rooms across the world, old VHS tapes were pulled off shelves and dusted off, families gathering to watch him slam Andre the Giant or tear his shirt in half one more time. The night of the official tribute show arrived just 1 week after his funeral. The arena was packed, every seat filled with fans wearing red and yellow. The stage was draped in banners reading "Hogan Forever" and "Think of the Love." The event opened not with a match, but with a video package. His greatest in-ring moments, his most heartfelt promos, and clips of him laughing backstage, all set to the sound of Real American. The crowd erupted as the video ended, standing for a thunderous ovation that lasted nearly 5 minutes. Some chanted, "Hogan! Hogan!" Others simply cried, overwhelmed by the mix of joy and loss. One by one, legends of the industry took the microphone to share their stories. Some were hilarious tales of road trips gone wrong, while others were deeply personal moments of mentorship and kindness. Every story ended the same way, acknowledging that Hogan had left them and the world with more than just matches. He had left a blueprint for living boldly and loving deeply. By the time the final bell rang that night, it was clear that the immortal Hulk Hogan had achieved something rare. He had transcended the boundaries of sports entertainment and entered the realm of cultural legacy. His words, his presence, his unwavering belief in his fans, they would live on long after the cheers faded. And somewhere, beyond the reach of cameras and crowds, the man once known as the Immortal would be smiling, knowing his final wish had been granted. The world was thinking of the love, not the loss. Long after the crowd had left the tribute show and the arena lights dimmed to black, the real heart of the night unfolded in a small, dimly lit locker room tucked away behind the stage. Only a select few were allowed inside, men and women whose names were carved into wrestling history alongside Hogan's. Some were still in their gear, others had already changed into jeans and t-shirts, but all carried the same heavy look in their eyes. The adrenaline of performing had faded, replaced by a quiet, almost sacred stillness. This wasn't the part the cameras would ever see. This was family time. At the center of the room, on a long wooden bench, lay a neatly folded red and yellow feather boa, one of Hogan's favorites. It had been brought there by Jimmy Hart, his longtime friend and manager, who had carried it with him all day like a precious relic. Jimmy's usually animated voice was low, almost a whisper. "I figured it should be here with us," he said, his eyes glistening. "Feels like he's still in the room this way." No one disagreed. Ric Flair leaned back against the wall, arms crossed, his robe long since packed away. He was quiet for a long time before speaking, his tone stripped of the bravado the world knew him for. "You know, I wrestled him hundreds of times, maybe more. We'd tear each other apart out there, but the second we hit the curtain, he'd give me that grin and say, 'That's how you make magic, brother.'" Flair shook his head slowly, a bittersweet smile crossing his face. He wasn't just making magic for the crowd, he was making it for us too. Across the room, Randy Savage's brother, Lanny Poffo, sat with his hands clasped. He spoke softly, almost to himself, recalling the long drives between shows. We'd talk about life, about family. He never broke character for the fans, but in the car, he'd let you see Terry. And Terry was the kind of man you could trust with your life. Even the younger generation, wrestlers who had grown up idolizing Hogan, sat in reverent silence. Roman Reigns, who had shared several appearances with Hogan at big WWE events, leaned forward with his elbows on his knees. "He told me once that this business isn't about what you take from it, it's about what you give back." That's what being immortal really means. Triple H, now overseeing much of WWE's creative direction, stood in the corner, his mind clearly racing. After a moment, he spoke, his voice firm but emotional. "We can't just let his memory be a highlight reel. Hogan's legacy deserves something living, something that keeps giving." He looked around the room, catching the eyes of each person. "I'm talking about something permanent. Not just for us, but for every kid who picks up a dumbbell or laces up boots because they saw him do it first." There were nods all around. The idea grew legs quickly. By the time the locker room meeting broke up, a plan was forming. WWE would launch the Hulk Hogan Foundation, dedicated to mentoring young wrestlers, supporting youth athletics, and funding programs for underprivileged kids. It would carry his name, his colors, and his values forward for generations. Later that night, in Vince McMahon's office, the conversation took on a different tone. Vince, who had been uncharacteristically subdued since Hogan's passing, stared out the window for a long time before turning to Triple H and Stephanie McMahon. "We built an empire together," Vince said quietly. "Hulk Hogan was the cornerstone. Without him, I don't know if any of this would have been possible." He paused, his voice catching for just a moment. "We owe him more than a tribute show." Triple H laid out the foundation idea, and Vince didn't hesitate. "Do it. Fund it. And I want his name on the Hall of Fame stage again next year. Not just as an inductee, we'll rename the Legends Wing after him." Stephanie added another layer. "What if we also make WrestleMania weekend his weekend? Every year, the Friday night before the big show, we dedicate it to Hogan, highlighting the main eventers of tomorrow, just like he once was." Vince nodded slowly, and for the first time in days, a small smile cracked through his stoic expression. "Yeah, that's something he'd like." Meanwhile, outside of corporate boardrooms, in the quieter corners of the wrestling world, the personal reflections continued. In a small bar just blocks from the arena, a cluster of veterans gathered around a corner table: Kevin Nash, Scott Hall's brother, Booker T, and a handful of others. They nursed their drinks and swapped road stories, the kind that blurred the lines between legend and truth. Booker T told a story about a charity event in Houston years ago where Hogan had shown up unexpectedly, spending hours signing autographs for kids. "He didn't want a camera in sight," Booker said. told me, "The good stuff isn't for show, brother. It's for them." As the night wore on, the stories turned softer. People spoke about the way Hogan treated the ring crew, the security guys, the stagehands, the people most fans never think about. "He knew everyone's name," Nash said. "Didn't matter if you were the world champion or the guy sweeping up after the show. He made you feel like you mattered." In the days that followed, WWE quietly began collecting artifacts for a permanent Hogan exhibit at their corporate headquarters. Not just the iconic gear and belts, but handwritten letters, candid photos, and even the old yellow legal pads where he had scribbled ideas for promos. They wanted to show the human side of the legend, the man who stayed up all night perfecting a speech, who called sick kids before matches, who cried backstage when the Make-A-Wish kids left after meeting him. The wrestling industry had lost icons before, but this felt different. Maybe it was because Hogan's larger-than-life persona had convinced so many that he would somehow be here forever. Or maybe it was because his final words refused to let the story end in sadness. In every locker room, in every fan's heart, there was an unspoken agreement to honor that request, to think of the love, not the loss. Weeks later, at a small independent wrestling show in Florida, a rookie stepped into the ring wearing red and yellow gear. The crowd, mostly locals, started chanting Hogan without prompting. When the match ended, the young wrestler grabbed a microphone, his voice shaky. "I never met him," he said, "but I wouldn't be here without him. This is for you, Hulkster. I'll keep training, I'll say my prayers, and I'll eat my vitamins always." The crowd roared, and for a moment, it felt like Hogan himself had just walked through the curtain. Back in Clearwater, the family kept Hogan's mansion exactly as it was. His bedroom remained untouched, his boots by the dresser, his robe on the chair. It wasn't a shrine, it was home. And sometimes, on quiet evenings, they'd sit out on the balcony, looking over the water, remembering the way he used to lean on the railing and tell stories as the sun went down. In those moments, it was easy to believe he was still there, smiling, with that same booming laugh and that same unshakable faith in the power of love over loss. And in a way, he was. Because in every arena where fans chanted his name, in every gym where someone pushed through one more rep because of him, in every child who learned to believe in themselves because they'd heard his story, Hulk Hogan, the immortal, was still running wild. 1 year later, Clearwater woke to the same kind of golden sunrise Hogan used to talk about, the kind where the sky seemed to stretch forever, streaked with orange and crimson, the colors he once wore into the ring. The air was warm but gentle, carrying the salt of the ocean and the faint sound of gulls calling over the water. Down by the shoreline, a small crowd was gathering, not because of any advertised event, but because they knew what day it was. Fans, neighbors, and a handful of wrestlers who had flown and quietly stood barefoot in the sand. Some wore vintage Hulkamania shirts faded from years of washing. Others had tied red and yellow bandanas around their foreheads. The memorial area, established the year before by the city, had become a permanent fixture along the boardwalk. In the center stood a bronze statue of Hogan, not flexing in the ring, but smiling, arms open as if inviting the world in for one last embrace. At its base, engraved in bold letters, were his final words, "Think of the love, not the loss." It had become more than a phrase. Over the past year, it had turned into a living motto. Schools had adopted it as part of their anti-bullying campaigns. Gyms painted it on their walls. Wrestling promotions printed it on posters for charity events. Even outside the world of wrestling, the words resonated: funerals, weddings, graduations, retirement parties. Anywhere people wanted to remember what mattered most, Hogan's message found its way in. In WWE's Hall of Fame Legends Wing, now officially renamed the Hulk Hogan Legends Wing, a steady stream of visitors paused in front of his exhibit. The glass cases held the iconic gear, but it was the smaller items that made people linger. The handwritten notes to fans, the photographs of him visiting hospitals, the scuffed guitar from an impromptu jam session backstage in 1987. A video loop played quietly in the background, Hogan speaking in interviews about life, kindness, and never giving up. Parents often knelt beside their kids in that corner, explaining who he was. Not just the wrestler, but the man. The Hulk Hogan Foundation had grown faster than anyone predicted. What began as a scholarship program for aspiring wrestlers expanded to fund youth sports programs nationwide, restore community gyms, and provide mentorship to at-risk youth. At their first anniversary gala, Triple H took the stage and announced that over 15,000 kids had participated in foundation programs that year. Every one of them knows his name, he said. And more importantly, they know his values. The room rose to its feet, not in applause for the foundation, but in a shared tribute to the man it honored. On this anniversary morning in Clearwater, a private moment unfolded on the balcony of Hogan's mansion. His daughter stood alone, looking out over the water, her hair moving softly in the breeze. In her hand was a folded letter, one she had written to her father weeks after his passing, but never read aloud. She opened it now, speaking into the wind. "You were right, Dad," she said softly. "It's the love that stays. And I see it every day in the people you touched, in the way they treat each other, in the way they keep your spirit alive." She paused, glancing toward the horizon where the sunlight met the water. "I hope you're proud of what you left behind." Down at the memorial, the crowd began to hum Real American, not in the raucous, booming way it had once filled arenas, but slow and reverent, like a hymn. The sound carried up to the balcony. His daughter closed her eyes, letting it wash over her. Somewhere in the hum, there was laughter, there was memory, there was healing. Later that afternoon, across the country in a small wrestling school in Chicago, a rookie laced up his boots for his first match. Nervous energy buzzed through him as he tightened the laces. Above the mirror in the locker room, a sign read, "Think of the love, not the loss." The young wrestler touched it for luck before stepping into the ring. His trainer, a grizzled veteran who had once shared a card with Hogan, clapped him on the shoulder. "Go out there and make them believe, kid." That's what Hogan would have wanted. The crowd in the tiny gym roared, not because of the size of the event, but because of the spirit behind it. And somewhere in the collective heart of wrestling, there was a sense that Hogan was still here. In the cheers, in the laughter, in the moments when fans believed in something bigger than themselves. As the sun set over Clearwater that evening, the bronze statue's shadow stretched long over the sand. The last light of the day caught the engraved words at its base, making them glow like fire. Think of the love, not the loss. For those who had known him, those who had cheered for him, and even those who had only heard his story after he was gone, the message was clear. As the last traces of twilight faded from the Clearwater sky, the boardwalk remained alive with quiet conversation and soft music from a street performer who had planted himself near the Hogan Memorial. He strummed his guitar gently, playing old rock ballads from the 80s, songs Hogan himself used to blast from the speakers of his customized ride when cruising along the coast. Families lingered, reluctant to leave, as though walking away from the statue meant letting go of something they weren't ready to release. Nearby, a young boy, no more than 8, stood in front of the bronze figure holding his father's hand. He wore a fresh red bandana tied tightly around his head, just like the one Hogan had worn countless times. "Who is he, Dad?" the boy asked, his voice full of curiosity rather than sadness. The father knelt down beside him, looking up at the statue for a long moment before answering. "He was a man who made people believe they could be strong. Not just in here," he said, flexing his arm, "but in here too." He placed a hand over his chest. "And he told us to always remember the love we share." That's what made him special. It was scenes like this that played out across the world that night. In living rooms from Florida to Tokyo, fans streamed his most legendary matches. In pubs in the UK, groups of friends clinked glasses and toasted to the immortal. In a small town in Canada, a community center hosted a movie night featuring Suburban Commando and No Holds Barred, with kids giggling and parents grinning at the cheesy one-liners. Hogan's reach had always been global, but in the year since his passing, it had transformed into something deeper, something that belonged as much to the next generation as it did to those who had lived through his prime. Back at the WWE Performance Center in Orlando, the next class of recruits had gathered in the ring after a grueling training session. Their head coach, a grizzled veteran who had once taken a body slam from Hogan in front of 80,000 fans, addressed them. "You all came here to learn the moves," he began, pacing the mat. "But Hogan taught me, and the whole damn world, that wrestling isn't just about moves. It's about heart. It's about walking into an arena full of strangers and making them feel like they've known you their whole life. If you can do that, you'll make your mark. That's how you become unforgettable." One of the recruits, a young woman from Texas, raised her hand. "Coach, did you know him well?" The coach's eyes softened. "Well enough to know that he'd be watching all of you right now, hoping you give this everything you've got. And well enough to know that when you finally make it, he'd be the first one to shake your hand and call you brother." The room erupted in knowing laughter, the kind that comes from a shared piece of cultural history. Meanwhile, the Hulk Hogan Foundation had chosen this night to unveil its biggest project yet, a fully funded youth sports complex in Clearwater. The ribbon-cutting ceremony was scheduled for the next morning, but the facility's lights were already on, casting a glow over the pristine basketball courts, wrestling mats, and weight rooms. Inside, the walls were painted in vibrant red and yellow, and along one hallway, a massive mural depicted Hogan in mid-ring pose, his hand cupped to his ear, as if still listening for the roar of the crowd. Underneath, in bold lettering, were his final words, a constant reminder to every kid who walked through those doors. The foundation's director, a former wrestler turned philanthropist, spoke about the vision during a late-night interview with a local news station. "This isn't just about sports," she explained. "It's about giving kids a place to feel strong, supported, and seen. That's what Hogan stood for, whether he was in the ring or not. This place is going to carry that forward long after we're all gone." Back at Hogan's mansion, the family had gathered in the living room, a space still filled with his presence. The walls were lined with framed photos, some from his wrestling career, others from fishing trips, barbecues, and Christmas mornings. His son played an old home video on the TV, grainy footage of Hogan in his kitchen flipping pancakes while wearing a tank top and humming along to the radio. The room filled with laughter as they watched him accidentally burn the first batch, tossing them in the trash with an exaggerated, "That one's for the heel section, brother." It was a reminder that beyond the legend, beyond the spectacle, he was a man who loved to make people laugh, even over something as simple as breakfast. Later that night, as the family drifted off to bed, his daughter stepped outside onto the balcony one last time. The moonlight shimmered on the waves, and for a moment, she swore she could hear the faint echo of his voice, warm and reassuring. "It's okay, kiddo. Keep going. I'm still here." She smiled through her tears, whispering back, "I know, Dad." Across the water, the city lights of Clearwater reflected off the calm ocean surface. And in the silence of the night, it was clear that Hulk Hogan's story hadn't ended a year ago, it had simply shifted chapters. His voice lived on in chants that still broke out in arenas, in the advice whispered from trainers to rookies, in the quiet encouragement parents gave their children. His image stood tall not just in bronze, but in the hearts of those who had been touched by his life. The immortal had left the ring, but the match he started, the one for belief, unity, and love, was still going strong. And if you listened closely, in the right moment, you could almost hear him, grinning wide, calling out across the years, "What you gonna do when the love we've built runs wild on you?" The night was electric inside Madison Square Garden, the kind of energy you could feel in your chest before you even stepped through the arena doors. It wasn't just another WWE event, it was the culmination of something the wrestling world had been building toward for a year. Rumors had been swirling for months about the debut of a new star, someone the company believed could carry the torch of charisma, showmanship, and heart that Hulk Hogan had once wielded like no one else. Backstage, in the narrow hallways lined with cables, production crates, and crew members rushing between cues, a young wrestler stood alone in front of a mirror. His name was Chase Dalton. A second-generation competitor whose father had wrestled in small circuits and had once been on the undercard the night Hogan slammed Andre the Giant. Chase's red and yellow gear wasn't a gimmick. It was a tribute. Across the back of his jacket, in bold block letters, were Hogan's immortal words, "Think of the love, not the loss." He closed his eyes and took a deep breath. In his mind, he could hear the echoes of old VHS tapes he'd worn thin growing up. The booming voice, the pounding theme music, the way Hogan could point to a crowd and make everyone in the building feel like they were the most important person there. Chase's father had once told him, "Kid, there are wrestlers who win matches, and there are wrestlers who change the game." Hogan was the second kind. If you want to honor him, be the second kind. A knock at the door pulled Chase from his thoughts. It was Triple H, dressed sharp as always, but with that same gravelly tone that came from decades in the ring. "You ready, kid?" Chase nodded, but Triple H didn't move right away. "Listen," he said, lowering his voice. "This isn't just your debut. This is history connecting itself. The crowd doesn't know it yet, but you're about to carry a piece of Hogan out there with you. Don't waste it. Make them feel it." As Chase made his way to gorilla position, the staging area just before the entrance curtain, he could hear the crowd's restless roar. The show's host was hyping the debut, teasing the audience about a man trained in the spirit of Hulkamania. The lights dimmed, and a familiar guitar riff blared over the speakers. It wasn't exactly real American, but it was close enough to send a shiver through every fan who had ever torn a shirt in their living room. When Chase stepped through the curtain, the arena erupted. Some fans cheered instantly, swept up by the music and the red and yellow flash. Others hesitated, unsure if this was sacrilege or homage. But then they saw the way he cupped his hand to his ear, just like Hogan had, and the chant began almost on instinct. HGN. HGN. Chase soaked it in, letting the crowd build before charging down the ramp. His opponent, a towering heel with a reputation for crushing rookies, sneered from the ring. The bell rang and the match began fast, hard, and loud. Chase moved with the energy of someone wrestling not just for a win, but for a legacy. Every clothesline, every elbow drop felt like a nod to the man whose shadow stretched over the sport. Midway through the match, the heel caught Chase in a devastating power slam, leaving him flat on the mat. The crowd groaned. The opponent taunted them, mocking Hogan's poses. But as the referee's count reached 2, Chase's arm shot up. He began to shake his head, rising to one knee, then two, his face set in the same defiant glare Hogan had made famous. The crowd recognized it instantly and roared to their feet. "You!" Chase shouted at his opponent, jabbing a finger in his face, and the roof nearly came off the garden. With a burst of adrenaline, he unleashed a flurry of punches, whipped his opponent into the ropes, and delivered a thunderous boot to the face. The fans knew what was coming. Chase ripped off his jacket, bounced off the ropes, and dropped a leg across his opponent's chest. The referee's hand hit the mat 1, 2, 3. The building exploded. Chase rose to his feet, arms wide, pointing out at the crowd the way Hogan had in his prime. And then, just as the cheers reached their peak, the arena's giant screen lit up with a montage clips of Hogan's career, from slamming Andre to holding the mic for his last Hall of Fame speech. At the end, his voice filled the air. "Think of the love, not the loss." Chase stood in the ring, looking up at the screen, his chest heaving. He mouthed the words, "Thank you," before rolling out of the ring and walking back up the ramp. At the top, he turned one last time, raised his arm high, and pointed to the sky. Backstage, as he came through the curtain, veterans were waiting. Jimmy Hart hugged him tight, whispering, "He'd be proud, brother. Damn proud." Triple H clapped him on the shoulder, his eyes telling him more than words could. In the weeks that followed, the clip of Chase's debut went viral. Fans called it the passing of the torch. The red and yellow gear began to appear in arenas again, worn by a new generation who had only known Hogan through stories and footage. And every time Chase stepped into a ring, he carried with him not just the style and swagger of the immortal, but the message that had outlived the man himself. Because Hogan's legacy wasn't in the title belts or the sold-out arenas, it was in the belief that you could be larger than life and still lead with love. And now, that belief was in good hands. The match was far from over. The torch was still burning. And somewhere, in the heart of wrestling heaven, Hulk Hogan was smiling, watching it run wild once again. The screen fades in from black, the sound of distant ocean waves rolling in slow and steady. The camera drifts over Clearwater's coastline at dawn, the first light of day painting the water in gold and crimson. The bronze statue of Hulk Hogan stands in silhouette against the rising sun, his arms open wide, as if ready to embrace the world. A soft, familiar guitar riff begins, an acoustic reimagining of Real American. Over it, Hogan's voice, warm and confident, echoes from an old recording. Think of the love, not the loss. The montage begins. We see clips from the Foundation's youth complex, kids in red and yellow jerseys running across basketball courts, teens learning holds on the wrestling mats, a young boy tying his first bandana in front of a mirror. Coaches shout encouragement, parents clap from the sidelines, and on the far wall, Hogan's words are painted 10 feet high. The footage transitions to wrestling schools across the country. At one, a trainer stops mid-drill to tell a room full of rookies, the crowd doesn't care what you do until they know why you're doing it. Hogan taught us that. Remember it. Cut to an independent wrestling show in Mexico, 2 luchadors in custom gear, one in red and yellow. They shake hands before the bell rings. The crowd chants, Hogan. Hogan, even though most of them never saw him live. A smash cut takes us to Madison Square Garden. Chase Dalton raising his hand in victory, sweat dripping from his brow, pointing up to the sky. The camera catches him whispering, "Thank you," before the arena screen fills with Hogan's smiling face. Back in Clearwater, Hogan's family gathers on the mansion balcony at sunset. His daughter holds a framed photo of him from years before, shirt torn, arms flexed, grin wide. They laugh at a memory someone shares, the kind of laughter that comes from love healing over time. The camera lingers on their faces, catching the way they look at each other with the same warmth Hogan used to give to the world. The music swells as the montage shifts to international arenas, London, Tokyo, Sydney. At each, the lights dim, and the 10-bell salute begins. But after the final chime, the crowd breaks into song, not a chant, but a slow, united hum of Real American. Thousands of voices blending into one. Quick flashes follow. Murals of Hogan painted on city walls, charity runs with runners in red and yellow, fans raising replica belts in tribute, a boy in a hospital bed smiling as he watches an old WrestleMania on a tablet. The final image returns to Clearwater. A lone child stands before Hogan's statue, placing a single yellow flower at its base. He looks up at the engraving of the words, "Think of the love, not the loss." For a moment, the world is still. Then, faintly as if carried on the ocean wind, we hear him. "What you gonna do when the love we've built runs wild on you? Forever immortal." The last note of the guitar fades, replaced by the sound of waves, and the credits roll over archival clips of Hogan laughing, hugging fans, and walking away from the ring one last time, his hand raised high. In the days following the anniversary, the impact of Hulk Hogan's life and words seemed to grow even stronger. It was as if the tribute shows, the Foundation projects, and the passing of the torch to Chase Dalton had reignited something deep in the heart of the wrestling world, a shared memory of why they had fallen in love with it in the first place. News outlets that had once only covered wrestling during scandals or major pay-per-view events were now running feature-length pieces on Hogan's philosophy and his influence outside the ring. Documentaries aired on streaming platforms, weaving together rare home footage, interviews with family and friends, and previously unseen moments from his career. Clips went viral of him visiting children in hospitals, not for cameras or PR, but because he genuinely wanted to lift their spirits. The footage of him whispering to a child, "You're stronger than you think, brother," seemed to take on new life, as if those words now belonged to everyone who needed them. One night, WWE dedicated an entire episode of Monday Night Raw to the immortal legacy. Every match featured some kind of nod to Hogan, moves he had made famous, gear in his colors, even ring entrances that echoed his iconic strut. Midway through the show, the lights went out, and on the big screen, a simple montage played. No commentary, no narration. Just the sound of an arena crowd from decades ago chanting his name, layered over footage of him flexing, pointing to the crowd, and embracing fans. When the lights came back on, Chase Dalton was standing in the ring with a microphone. He didn't cut a typical wrestling promo. He didn't talk about his next match or his rivalries. Instead, he spoke about what Hogan had meant to him and to the business. "We're not just remembering Hulk Hogan the wrestler," Chase said, his voice